During the tumultuous and turbulent privatisation of many of Britain's primary industries, one name would stand out due to its existence being both resultant of the privatisation of the energy and the railway industries, that being National Power, the dominant force of Britain's fossil fuel energy production, which at one point held 52% of the market share. In order to control its supply chain, National Power exploited the wider upheaval of British Rail's privatisation to introduce its own dedicated rolling stock and locomotives to power its trains, though the existence of this company on UK rails would be very brief, as poor management decisions, regulatory constraints and an ever-contracting market saw National Power face total collapse within a decade of its formation. The roots of National Power stretch back to the earliest days of electricity generation in Britain, when in 1881, electric lighting was first introduced to British streets, marking one of the first practical applications of electricity, while over the following decades, electricity generation expanded rapidly, but in a highly fragmented and uncoordinated fashion. By 1921, over 480 authorised but independent electricity undertakings operated across England and Wales, each of which generated and supplied power using their own technical standards, leading to a chaotic patchwork of systems running on varying voltages and frequencies, leading to operational inefficiencies, duplication of resources, and uneven access to reliable electricity across different regions. Recognising the inherent inefficiencies of this fragmented system, the government intervened through the Electric Supply Act of 1926, with this legislation creating the Central Electricity Board, which was tasked with overseeing the establishment of a coordinated national transmission system, with the board facilitating the construction of the national grid, which linked the numerous isolated generating stations into an integrated network. By the mid-1930s, this national grid was largely completed, enabling electricity to be transmitted more efficiently across long distances, reducing the need for costly local generation, and stabilizing supply throughout England and Wales. The role of the state in the electricity industry deepened substantially in the aftermath of World War II, and as part of the broader post-war nationalisation programme led by Clement Attlee's Labour government, the Electricity Act of 1947 brought the entire industry into public ownership, merging 505 separate distribution and supply organisations into 12 regional area boards, each responsible for distributing electricity within a designated geographic area. At the same time, responsibility for generation and high-voltage transmission was assigned to a single government-controlled authority, centralising control over the industry's most capital-intensive assets, with this move aiming to ensure consistent investment, equitable access, and reliable service across the country, reflecting the government's commitment to comprehensive public provision of essential utilities. Further consolidation took place under the Electricity Act of 1957, which established the Central Electricity Generating Board, or CEGB, which became the dominant institution within the industry, assuming full responsibility for electricity generation and transmission in England and Wales, acting as both generator and transmitter by supplying electricity in bulk to the area boards, who in turn handled local distribution and direct sales to customers. The CEGB owned and operated all major power stations, managed the national transmission grid, and directed investment in new generating capacity, with this vertically integrated structure enduring for 3 decades, characterized by long-term planning, centralized decision-making, and insulation from market pressures. However, by the early 1980s, the state-dominated model increasingly came under political scrutiny, with the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher viewing state ownership across various industries as inefficient, unresponsive to consumer needs, and resistant to innovation. Privatisation was therefore seen as the means to stimulate competition, attract private capital, and drive improvements in operational efficiency, and the electricity industry, with its substantial infrastructure and large workforce, became a key target within this broader ideological shift, with the privatisation of British Gas in 1986 setting a precedent, emboldening the government to pursue similar reforms in the electricity sector. In 1987, the government formally announced its intention to privatise the electricity industry in England and Wales, with the legislative foundation for this being established through the Electricity Act of 1989, which dismantled the CEGB and distributed its assets and responsibilities among a number of newly formed entities with distinct operational roles, each intended to function as independent commercial enterprises within a competitive market framework. Under the reorganisation prescribed by the Act, the CEGB's generation assets were split into 3 separate generating companies: National Power, Powergen, and Nuclear Electric, with National Power being allocated the largest share of the CEGB's conventional fossil-fueled power stations, while PowerGen received a smaller portion of the fossil fuel generation capacity, and Nuclear Electric assumed control of the CEGB's nuclear facilities. In addition to these generating companies, the transmission assets, which included the National High Voltage Electricity Grid, were transferred to the newly established National Grid Company, or NGC, with ownership of the NGC being assigned to the 12 regional electricity companies, or RECs, which themselves were created from the previously existing area boards that had overseen the local distribution and supply of electricity under state ownership. National Power was formally incorporated as a public limited company, or PLC, in 1990, and from its inception occupied a dominant position within the newly liberalised electricity market, inheriting approximately 52% of England and Wales' total generating capacity, which equated to a formidable declared net capacity of 29,486 megawatts. This capacity was spread across 40 power stations, many of which were large-scale coal and oil-fired plants that formed the backbone of the country's electricity supply at the time, while by comparison, its closest competitor, PowerGen, acquired generation assets totaling 18,164 megawatts, while Nuclear Electric controlled a further 8,357 megawatts of nuclear capacity. The privatisation process was executed in stages, with the first phase involving the flotation of the 12 regional electricity companies at the end of 1990, attracting widespread interest from private investors, with the government initially retaining a 40% holding in both National Power and PowerGen, while the following year, the government moved ahead with the partial sale of National Power's shares to the public, releasing the majority of its holding onto the market, generating substantial proceeds for the exchequer, but also marking the full transition of National Power from a state-owned utility to a publicly traded private company accountable to its shareholders. From the moment it entered the private sector, National Power faced substantial internal pressure to modernize and streamline its operations in order to meet shareholder expectations for profitability and growth, as prior to privatisation, the company's workforce totaled approximately 17,000 employees, a legacy of its origins within the labour-intensive state sector. In the years following its formation, National Power implemented a comprehensive program of cost-cutting, rationalisation and efficiency improvements, with this restructuring involving significant workforce reductions, with staff numbers falling to just over 5,000 by 1995, this aggressive downsizing being accompanied by operational changes aimed at improving productivity, lowering fuel procurement costs, and optimising plant utilisation. Anticipating the limitations of relying solely on the domestic market for long-term growth, National Power pursued a deliberate strategy of diversification and international expansion, with 1993 seeing the company establish a dedicated international division tasked with identifying and developing overseas investment opportunities, while that same year, National Power completed its first significant international acquisition with the £103 million purchase of American National Power, a company operating power plants across Virginia, Georgia and New Jersey in the United States. This transaction marked the beginning of National Power's international portfolio, which soon expanded to include a leading role in a consortium developing the Pego power station in Portugal and a £64 million investment in a major oil-fired power station in Pakistan, while at the same time, it also began to transform its domestic generation assets. Environmental regulations, combined with economic pressures, were driving the electricity industry to seek cleaner and more efficient technologies, with coal-fired generation, which had long been the cornerstone of Britain's electricity supply, facing increasing scrutiny due to its contribution to sulfur dioxide emissions and acid rain. And in response, National Power embraced the growing shift towards gas-fired power stations, a trend widely referred to as the dash for gas. In 1993, the company completed its first combined cycle gas turbine or CCGT power station at Killingholme in South Humberside, with CCGT technology offering several advantages, including higher thermal efficiency, lower emissions, shorter construction times, and greater operational flexibility compared to conventional coal-fired plants, with the successful commissioning of Killingholme marking National Power's entry into a new era of cleaner, gas-based generation, with several additional CCGT plants planned for construction in subsequent years. In parallel with these developments, National Power sought greater control over its fuel supply logistics, with 1993 also seeing the formal establishment of legislation that would privatise British Rail under the Railways Act of that year, dismantling its long-standing statutory monopoly over rail freight services, ending decades of state control, and allowing private companies, including industrial operators such as National Power, to run freight services independently. Under the new regulatory framework, companies were able to secure track access agreements with Railtrack, the newly created infrastructure owner, enabling them to operate their own rolling stock on the national rail network, with the government's rail freight privatisation strategy, laid out in the Rail Freight Privatisation Policy document, seeking to create a competitive market environment where freight operators would negotiate access charges and compete directly for business, driving efficiency and cost savings across the sector. Traditionally, the transportation of raw materials for the company had been handled exclusively by British Rail Freight, but National Power found itself increasingly frustrated with the inflexibility and high costs associated with these arrangements, with the company spending over £150 million each year on rail freight services, and as its government-imposed contracts with British Rail Freight approached expiry in March 1994, it actively explored alternative logistics strategies to gain greater control over its supply chain and reduce freight costs. In anticipation of operating its own rail services, National Power embarked on the procurement of locomotives and rolling stock specifically tailored to its operational needs, with 1991 seeing the firm place an order for its first diesel-electric locomotive with General Motors Canadian Division Electromotive Division or EMD, specifically for a single Class 59 heavy freight locomotive, as based on earlier units delivered to Foster Yeoman and ARC Southern during the mid to late 1980s. The Class 59 had proven itself to be infinitely more reliable and flexible than anything on offer from the domestic locomotive builders, demonstrating a 95% availability, while also able to match the likes of the Class 56, 58 and 60 for the haulage of some of the toughest freight loads in regular circulation on the UK network, while its modular design, based on the American SD40-2, meant maintenance was easy and intuitive. The first locomotive, 59201, was delivered to the port of Hull in February 1994, complete with a bell fitted to the front of the cabs as per the tradition of General Motors to fit such a feature to the first members of its locomotive series, and after undergoing inspection and commissioning at Derby, it entered service in March 1994, with the locomotive being immediately tasked with hauling limestone from quarries in Buxton to Drax Power Station, transporting essential material required for the flue gas desulfurization or FGD plant under construction at Drax. The FGD plant, costing approximately £700 million, was part of a wider programme to bring National Power's operations into compliance with tightening environmental regulations, both domestic and European, aimed at reducing sulfur dioxide emissions and addressing the problem of acid rain. In addition to securing locomotives, National Power invested in specialised rolling stock designed for its limestone operations, with late 1993 seeing the firm take delivery of its first batch of bogie hopper wagons built by Powell Dufferin SA in France, with the initial prototype wagon, numbered NP 19400, being shipped to the UK via the Dover to Dunkirk train ferry in November 1993. The full order consisted of 21 JHA wagons, with a design similar in appearance to ARC's JHA aggregate hoppers, but tailored for limestone traffic, with these wagons riding on advanced Powell Dufferin LTF-25 bogies, which provided a smoother ride and permitted higher operational speeds, improving efficiency and reliability. Prior to the full delivery of these wagons, National Power conducted operational trials using hired tip-hook hoppers to test the viability of limestone flows between Tunstead and Drax, and the dedicated fleet had entered service by April 1994, primarily focused on limestone transportation, but also occasionally covering aggregate flows on behalf of other operators such as ARC, demonstrating their operational flexibility. By the end of 1994, National Power's ambitions extended beyond limestone haulage as it turned its attention to securing control over coal transport to its power stations, with preparatory trials for coal haulage having taken place as early as 1992, again utilising hired tip-hook KPA bogie hoppers, and building on the success of its limestone operations, the company placed a substantial order in 1995 for an additional 5 Class 59/2 locomotives, numbered 59202 to 206. These locomotives arrived at Hull in August 1995 and were subsequently allocated to National Power's newly established rail depot at Ferrybridge in West Yorkshire, with the Class 59/2 fleet incorporating several technical refinements over earlier models, including the installation of yaw dampers to permit higher maximum speeds of up to 75 miles an hour, carbon dioxide-based fire suppression systems, nickel-cadmium batteries, drop-head knuckle couplers for rapid coupling and uncoupling, and sophisticated slow-speed control systems optimized for merry-go-round coal delivery operations at power stations. To support the expanded coal operations, National Power also commissioned a large second batch of purpose-built hopper wagons, with 85 JMA coal hoppers being ordered, manufactured by OY Transtech of Finland and imported into the UK as kits, with final assembly being carried out at the Ferrybridge depot. These new wagons, measuring approximately 65 feet in length and also equipped with LTF-25 bogies, were significantly larger than the earlier limestone JHAs and specifically designed for transporting coal from multiple sources, including Gascoigne Wood, which served the Selby coalfield, Immingham docks and various inland collieries, to Drax and Eggborough power stations. By early 1996, National Power's vertically integrated rail freight operation had become fully established, with the company now controlling a dedicated fleet of 6 highly advanced Class 59 locomotives and a total of 106 specialized hopper wagons, with each of the 59s being named after the vales in which the company's power stations were located, while during the week, few or no examples of the class could be found at the Ferrybridge depot, as they were out on duty and only returned for routine maintenance on the weekend. Sadly, National Power's once commanding position within the British electricity market was coming under sustained pressure, with the privatisation of the sector and National Power's dominance of it having seen the Office of Electricity Regulation force the company to divest itself on a significant portion of its generating assets, with approximately 4,000 megawatts of capacity, or around 15% of its total, being sold off. This intervention marked a critical turning point, and the company's ability to rely on its dominant domestic market share to drive growth was severely weakened, while its rival Powergen quickly adapted, exploiting the rapid expansion of gas-fired generation and securing downstream interest through the acquisition of a regional electricity company. Faced with mounting pressures to diversify its fuel mix and reduce harmful emissions, National Power embarked on a dual strategy that combined substantial investment in new gas-fired power stations with environmental upgrades to its existing coal-fired facilities, central to which was the vast Drax power station in North Yorkshire, which underwent an ambitious but costly FGD retrofit aimed at cutting sulfur dioxide emissions by up to 90%. The scale of the Drax upgrade was enormous both technically and financially, reflecting the growing burden of environmental compliance being placed upon traditional coal generators during this period of regulatory tightening in both Westminster and Brussels, thus forming one of the founding reasons as to why National Power invested heavily in limestone hoppers and sought control of its own supply chain from the former British Rail. Despite the investment, National Power's independent rail freight operation was short-lived, as with the concurrent privatisation of British Rail's freight sector, this led to the emergence of English, Welsh and Scottish Railways, or EWS, as formed by Ed Burkhardt's Wisconsin Central Group, which acquired the bulk of British Rail's freight division by 1996. EWS rapidly established dominance in the freight market, offering lower haulage rates and capturing business across multiple sectors, with National Power's brief experiment in operating its own trains having served its purpose by providing leverage and contract negotiations, but ultimately lacked long-term viability in a rapidly consolidating rail freight market. In April 1998, National Power sold its entire rail freight operation to EWS, transferring all 6 Class 59 locomotives and the full fleet of wagons, with EWS gradually redeploying the equipment across its broader rail freight network, while the hopper wagons were later rebogied, renumbered and reassigned to other duties, particularly in the aggregates and construction sectors, where their design characteristics, especially their high-speed bogies, proved advantageous. As the decade progressed, National Power's wider business problems deepened considerably, as with its domestic generation base shrinking and revenue growth faltering, the company looked abroad in search of profitable expansion, embarking on an aggressive international investment program, acquiring or developing generation assets in the United States, Pakistan, Australia, the Czech Republic, Spain, and other regions. However, this rapid overseas expansion was poorly timed and haphazardly executed, with many of these foreign investments being made at inflated prices in highly competitive or politically unstable markets, or with few offering the dependable earnings needed to offset domestic weaknesses. These risks became painfully apparent in 1998, when the government of Pakistan abruptly withheld payments to the Hub and Kotadu power plants, both of which were partly owned by National Power, with the result being a sharp decline in expected overseas revenues, adding to mounting investor anxiety. At home, National Power made a series of financial decisions that further weakened its position, as when the Southern Company of Atlanta expressed takeover interest in April 1996, the British government intervened to block the bid, exercising its golden share, though nonetheless, National Power attempted to fortify itself against future threats by paying shareholders a £1.2 billion special dividend. While this temporarily placated investors, it dramatically increased the company's gearing and left it with much less room to maneuver financially, precisely at a time when competition, pricing pressures, and regulatory uncertainty demanded maximum flexibility, while the unwinding of long-term coal supply agreements in 1998 exposed further vulnerabilities, as National Power found itself unable to negotiate commercially favorable replacements, triggering profit warnings and eroding market confidence even more. By the beginning of 1999, National Power was visibly unraveling, with a series of management miscalculations combined with the escalating risks of international ventures and intensifying regulatory pressure at home, leaving the company rudderless, while talks of a possible merger with United Utilities in early 1999 collapsed, revealing the extent of National Power's strategic desperation. The resignation of its chief executive, Keith Henry, in mid-1999 was seen as a final admission of failure, as under his leadership, National Power had failed to successfully navigate the transition from a dominant regulated utility into a nimble, competitive international energy player, with poor judgment in overseas markets, internal leadership weaknesses, and a lack of coherent vision, leaving the company vulnerable and adrift. The end came in October 2000, as under mounting shareholder pressure and with no viable recovery plan, National Power was formally broken up, with its domestic UK operations being spun off as Innergy, while its international assets were transferred to a new company called International Power, with Innergy being subsequently acquired by German utility company RWE and being rebranded as N-Power, while International Power was eventually absorbed by ENGIE. Thus, within just a decade of privatisation, National Power, once the dominant electricity generator in England and Wales, ceased to exist, with its fall being driven by a toxic mix of poorly conceived privatisation policies, strategic blunders, financial mismanagement, ill-judged foreign expansion, and the company's failure to adapt effectively to the forces reshaping the energy sector both domestically and globally. However, despite the briefness of its existence, National Power's railway operations left an indelible mark on the face of Britain's rail freight scene, as it not only introduced a new batch of exceptional Class 59 locomotives that would form the wider precursor to the more successful Class 66, but also brought onto the market vastly superior limestone and coal hoppers that far outstripped the smaller MGR hoppers of the mid-1960s, while even today, the iconic blue, red and cream of the former National Power Company can still be found enduring on many of these vehicles as they continue to ply their merry trade across the UK's freight system.